The court papers hit my hands like a death sentence. My husband's name, my name, and the word bigamy stamped in red. A stranger named Elena Rodriguez stood in the hospital hallway, smiling as she claimed my 8-year marriage was a lie. Now I'm bracing my shoulder against our front door, teeth clenched, as a process server shoves against the other side, screaming about seizing everything. The ledger in my hand is my only weapon. Proof my husband's firm was built on blackmail. But if that door opens, I lose it all. The sliding glass doors of Northwest Memorial hissed shut, sealing Sarah inside a lobby thick with the scent of industrial lemon and stale coffee. She clutched a plastic bag of grapes, the stems digging into her palm through the thin film. A squeak of rubber soles echoed off the polished linoleum. A woman stood behind the reception desk, her face a mask of practiced neutrality. 2 security guards flanked her, their thumbs hooked into heavy utility belts. Sarah tightened her grip on the grapes. She had discussed the schedule on the phone. Her husband, David, needed consistency. He was drifting in the quiet hum of the intensive care unit, and Sarah was his only anchor. "We discussed this," Sarah said, her voice thin but steady. "My husband gets agitated if I miss the morning window." The woman stepped forward, her heels clicking like a metronome against the tile. She didn't reach for the fruit. Instead, she extended a thick manila envelope. The paper crinkled, stiff and cold against Sarah's wrist. "This isn't about the schedule, Sarah," the woman said, her voice dropping to a professional murmur that didn't reach her eyes. "The board met an hour ago. I'm Elena Rodriguez. I believe we have much to discuss regarding David's estate." Sarah stared at the bold, black lettering on the top sheet. Permanent injunction. The words blurred into a jagged smear of ink. She tried to sidestep the trio, but the taller guard shifted, his broad shoulder blocking the path to the elevators. The hum of the cooling system filled the silence, a low vibration that rattled in Sarah's teeth. Elena's presence was a physical weight, a claim staked on a man Sarah had shared a bed with for 8 years. "Please," Sarah whispered, the bag of grapes slipping an inch. "It's his birthday." Elena's hand remained steady, the envelope a physical barrier between them. "You need to leave the premises immediately. If you attempt to access the 4th floor, they will escort you to the precinct. You are no longer recognized as next of kin." The grapes hit the floor with a dull thud. One purple sphere rolled toward the guard's boot, gleaming under the harsh fluorescent lights. Sarah's fingers remained curled in the air, grasping at the space where the handle used to be. She felt the river stone in her pocket, the smooth, cool weight of it. She rubbed it once, twice, 3 times. 7 rubs to stay on the ground. The world felt like it was tilting, the sterile white walls leaning in to crush her. Elena wasn't just a stranger. She was a wrecking ball aimed at the foundation of Sarah's life. Driven by a desperate, cold fire, Sarah retreated from the hospital, the scent of bleach still stinging her nostrils. She didn't go home to cry. She called her sister Megan. Within the hour, they were standing before the heavy mahogany door of David's home office. The door was locked, a final secret from a man currently silenced by machines. Sarah didn't have the key. David had always kept this room as his sanctum. "Do it," Sarah said, her voice sounding like grinding gravel. Megan, her blue hair messy and a lukewarm coffee clutched in her left hand, wedged the tip of a crowbar into the doorframe. The wood groaned, a long, splintering shriek that echoed through the empty hallway. With a violent crack, the bolt gave way. The smell of old paper and expensive cologne wafted out, a ghost of David's public persona. The room was a fortress of shadows. Sarah lunged for the desk, her fingers trembling as she tore through drawers. She wasn't looking for mementos. She was looking for a weapon. She needed a divorce decree, a paper trail, anything to prove Elena Rodriguez was a liar. Megan sat at the computer, her fingers flying across the keys in a rhythmic patter. "He's got layers of protection on these files, Sarah," Megan muttered, taking a sip of her 140-degree latte. "It's like he was expecting someone to come digging. Why would a consultant have this much security on a home drive?" Sarah ignored her, pulling out a stack of binders. She checked the timestamps, the dates, the signatures. She was a woman of receipts, a curator of facts. But the more she dug, the more the facts seemed to dissolve. There were no divorce papers. There were no records of a previous marriage at all. It was as if Elena had dropped out of the sky to claim a life that Sarah had built brick by brick. The silence of the house was shattered by a heavy, rhythmic pounding on the front door. It wasn't a knock. It was a demand. Sarah froze, her hand hovering over a leather-bound ledger she had just pulled from a floorboard cavity. "Sarah Miller!" A voice boomed from the porch, muffled by the thick oak. "I have a court order for the seizure of assets. Open the door." Sarah hurried to the foyer, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Through the sidelight window, she saw a man who looked like he was made of gristle and bad intentions. Robert Clark, the process server, stood there with a slumped, martyr-like posture, clutching a stack of papers. "You can't come in," Sarah shouted through the wood. "My lawyer's on the way." "The law doesn't wait for your lawyer, lady," Robert sneered. He shoved his shoulder against the door, just as Sarah reached for the deadbolt. The force threw her back, her sneakers skidding on the hardwood. She lunged forward, throwing her entire weight against the door. It was a primal, desperate struggle. She could feel the vibration of his boots kicking at the base of the wood. The scent of his cheap tobacco and sweat seeped through the cracks. Sarah's breath came in ragged gasps. She reached out, her fingers finding the brass lock, and with a final, agonizing shove, she clicked it into place. The man outside let out a string of curses, his fist thudding against the center panel one last time. "I'll be back with the sheriff, Miller. Enjoy the house while you still have it." Sarah leaned her forehead against the cool wood, her chest heaving. She felt the stone in her pocket. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. She was still here. The house was still hers for now. But the walls felt thinner, the sanctuary compromised. She returned to the office, where Megan was staring at the leather-bound ledger Sarah had dropped. The book was old, the edges frayed, but the ink inside was dark and precise. Sarah flipped through the pages. It wasn't a diary. It was a record of consulting fees, vast sums of money moving from David's firm to accounts Sarah didn't recognize. "Look at the signatures, Megan," Sarah whispered, pointing to the bottom of a transfer for $50,000. Beside David's flowing script was a second set of initials, sharp and angular. M.S. "Mark Stevens," Megan said, her voice dropping. "David's partner. He didn't just know about the money, he co-signed the transfers. Every single one of these is a hush money payment." Sarah felt a cold prickle of realization. This wasn't just a domestic dispute. The firm, the house, the very life she lived, was built on a foundation of illicit financial transfers. Mark Stevens wasn't just a business partner, he was an accomplice. And if Mark was involved, the danger wasn't just legal, it was physical. The next morning, the air in Northwest Memorial felt even more pressurized. Sarah had changed into a sharp blazer, her hair pulled back into a tight, defensive knot. She couldn't get past the front desk, but she knew the shift changes. She knew the back entrances. She found the head nurse, a woman named Patricia, who wore an identical white blouse with a small 22 embroidered on the sleeve. Sarah approached her in the cafeteria, away from the prying eyes of security. She reached into her bag and pulled out an envelope containing $5,000. The emergency cash she kept in the floorboard. "I just need to see his medical directive," Sarah said, her voice a low, urgent hum. "I know Elena is listed, but I need to know if there's an addendum. Please, he's my husband." Patricia looked at the envelope, then at Sarah. For a second, Sarah saw a flicker of hesitation. The nurse's eyes darted to the clock. But then, the woman's face hardened into a mask of bureaucratic indifference. "I don't take bribes, Mrs. Miller," Patricia said, her voice like sandpaper. "And I don't break the schedule. Number 22 dictates that you leave now. The schedule is the schedule." Before Sarah could retract the offer, Patricia raised a hand and signaled to a pair of guards standing near the exit. "Security, we have a disturbance in the dining hall." Sarah bolted. She didn't think, she just ran. She ducked behind a tray rack, the smell of steamed vegetables and floor wax filling her lungs. She found a service door and took the stairs 2 at a time, her heart drumming a frantic rhythm. She could hear the heavy thud of boots above her, the metallic jangle of keys. She burst into the 4th-floor hallway, gasping for air, only to find Elena Rodriguez waiting by the elevators. Elena wasn't alone. A deputy in a tan uniform stood beside her, his hand resting on his holster. "You were warned, Sarah," Elena said, her unblinking eyes fixed on Sarah's face. "This is a trespassing violation. Deputy, take her out." Sarah didn't wait for the hand on her shoulder. She spun around and lunged back into the service stairwell, the heavy door slamming shut behind her. She spiraled down the concrete steps, the numbers on the walls blurring. 4, 3, 2, 1. She hit the basement level and burst into the parking garage, the air damp and smelling of exhaust. She fumbled for her keys as she ran toward her SUV. But as she approached, she stopped dead. The vehicle was slumped on its rims, all 4 tires carved open with jagged, violent slashes. The rubber hung like dead skin. A low growl of an engine echoed through the concrete cavern. A black sedan with windows so dark they looked like ink idled 20 yards away. It didn't move. It just watched. Sarah backed away, her hand gripping the camera bag slung over her shoulder. She was being hunted in the dark. A shadow detached itself from a concrete pillar to her left. A man in a black tactical mask stepped into the light of a flickering fluorescent bulb. He didn't say a word. He just started cracking his knuckles. 1, 2, 3. A rhythmic pop, pop, pop that signaled the end of a countdown. "Give me the book, Sarah," the man said, his voice muffled by the fabric. "I don't have it," she lied, her fingers tightening on the strap of her heavy professional camera bag. He lunged. He was fast, moving with a precision that felt rehearsed. He grabbed her arm, his fingers like steel bands, and tried to wrench the bag from her shoulder. Sarah screamed, a raw, guttural sound that echoed off the low ceiling. She didn't pull away. She leaned into him, using his momentum. She swung the heavy bag with everything she had, the metal casing of her zoom lens connecting with the side of his head with a sickening thud. The man grunted, his grip loosening for a fraction of a second. It was all she needed. She shoved him back and sprinted toward the elevator bank. The doors were already beginning to slide shut. She dived through the gap, her shoulder clipping the sensor. The doors hissed closed, sealing her inside the vibrating metal box just as a heavy fist slammed against the outside of the door. She hit the button for the lobby, her breath coming in jagged sobs. She was alive. She had the ledger. But she was trapped in a city that no longer felt like home. 2 hours later, Sarah sat in a dimly lit motel room on the edge of town, the neon sign outside flickering a rhythmic red. Megan sat on the edge of the bed, her laptop glowing. She had spent the last hour verifying the documents they had salvaged from the office. "I found it, Sarah," Megan said, her voice uncharacteristically soft. "The original marriage certificate from your wedding in Miami. I pulled the digital scan from the county archives." Sarah felt a surge of hope. This was it. The anchor. The proof that she existed in David's life. "Does it match? Is the notary seal there?" "It's here," Megan said, turning the screen around. "But Sarah, look closer at the seal. Look at the registration number." Sarah leaned in, her eyes scanning the ornate stamp. She knew the patterns of official documents. She had spent years filing them. Her heart skipped a beat. The number on the seal didn't match the state registry for that year. The font was slightly off, a microscopic deviation that only someone obsessed with detail would notice. "It's a forgery," Sarah whispered, the world beginning to tilt. "David made it." She rubbed the stone in her pocket. 1, 2, 3. She realized with a sickening clarity why there were no divorce papers. There had never been a legal marriage to divorce. David hadn't married her. He had performed a play. He had hired a fake notary, printed a fake certificate, and given her a fake life. He had kept her in a legal vacuum, a ghost who thought she was a wife. "He did this on purpose," Sarah said, her voice flat. "He didn't want to be tied to me. He wanted a wife he could delete whenever he got bored. I'm not his widow. I'm just a woman who lived in his house for 8 years." The realization was a physical blow. Her entire identity, the binders of receipts, the chronological logs, they were all documentation of a lie. She wasn't fighting Elena for an estate. She was fighting for a shadow. The next morning, the financial blow landed. Sarah tried to use her debit card at a gas station, only to have the machine flash a cold, red declined. She called the bank, her voice trembling. "There's a freeze on the account, Ms. Miller," the representative said. "A formal lawsuit was filed this morning by Mark Stevens. He's alleging embezzlement of corporate funds. All assets associated with the Miller estate and its beneficiaries are locked pending a forensic audit." Sarah stood by the gas pump, the smell of fumes making her dizzy. She was broke. She had no car, no access to her money, and a husband who was legally a stranger. She was being erased. She met her lawyer, Jennifer Vance, in a secluded park downtown. Jennifer stood within her 3-foot radius of personal space, her gray suit sharp enough to cut glass. She didn't offer a hand or a tissue. She simply hummed "Happy Birthday" under her breath as she looked at a file. "I have something," Jennifer said, her voice clipped. "I found a witness, an IT consultant named Thomas Wright who worked for the firm. He saw David and Elena together 3 weeks ago. They weren't fighting, they were coordinating. This proves the estrangement Elena claimed in court was a fabrication. There was a conspiracy between them." "Can he testify?" Sarah asked, a spark of desperation in her eyes. "He's terrified. He'll meet us at the pier tonight, 9 p.m. If he gives us the dual server logs, we can prove David was using the firm's money to support Elena while pretending she was an ex-wife. It breaks their standing." The pier was a lonely stretch of rotting wood and salt air. Rain drifted down in a fine, gray mist. making the planks slick. Sarah waited at the very end, near a telephone booth that stood like a silent sentry. The smell of decaying kelp was heavy in the air. A figure emerged from the shadows. But it wasn't the nervous IT consultant. It was Mark Stevens. He looked massive in his dark overcoat, his jaw set in a line of pure aggression. He checked his gold watch and tapped the glass. "You're a hard woman to find, Sarah," Mark said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. "But you're out of moves. Hand over the ledger." He stepped closer, invading her space. Sarah backed away, her heels catching on the uneven wood. Behind her, the dark water of the Sound churned, a cold, hungry void. "I know what you did, Mark," Sarah said, her voice shaking. "I know about the hush money. I know you co-signed the transfers." "Knowing and proving are two different things," Mark sneered. He reached out, his hand gripping her shoulder. The smell of his expensive cologne and old sweat was suffocating. "The ledger is corporate property. If you don't give it to me, I'll make sure you disappear just as thoroughly as David's marriage did." He shoved her against the railing, the wood groaning under the pressure. Sarah felt the cold spray of the water on her neck. She reached into her coat pocket, her fingers brushing against something heavy and cylindrical. Not the stone, the emergency flare she had taken from her car's safety kit. With a scream of defiance, she pulled the tab. A blinding, white-hot light erupted between them, a sun born in the middle of the rain. Mark roared, shielding his eyes as the flare hissed and sputtered. The smell of sulfur and scorched air filled the space. Sarah didn't look back. She scrambled past him, her feet pounding on the slick wood. She reached the street and hailed a passing taxi, diving into the back seat as the driver sped away. She watched the pier recede, a single point of artificial light dying in the darkness. She went straight to the hospital. She didn't care about the injunction. She found Elena in the hallway outside David's room, the woman looking tired, her hair finally beginning to fray at the edges. "Why?" Sarah demanded, cornering her near the nurse's station. "Why did you stay? If he was with me, if he was lying to you too, why fight for him?" Elena looked at her, and for the first time, the mask of neutrality broke. There was a deep, jagged grief in her eyes, but also a cruel triumph. "You think you were the victim?" Elena whispered. "I never signed the divorce papers because David begged me not to. He told me you were a phase, a stability project he needed to clear his head. He wanted a safety net, Sarah. He wanted to know that if things got too real with you, he could always point to me and say, 'Sorry, I'm already taken.' He used us both to make sure he never had to be anyone's husband." The truth hit Sarah like a physical blow. She wasn't the wife, and Elena wasn't the mistress. They were both just parts of a machine David had built to keep himself free. He had played them against each other, using the law as a puppet string. "He's a ghost, Sarah," Elena said, turning back toward the room. "And now, you are too." Sarah watched as the hospital staff began the administrative process. She saw the clipboard, the white blouses, the cold, efficient movements. They were changing the records. Next of kin, Elena Rodriguez. Sarah Miller was no longer a name on the chart. She was a legal ghost. She walked out of the hospital, the rain soaking through her blazer. She had no home to go to, no money in her pocket, and no husband in the bed. She was arrested an hour later. A probation violation for a charge she didn't recognize, a ghost of a crime planted in the system. She sat in a cold holding cell, the drip of a leaky faucet sounding like a gunshot against the metal basin. She looked at the concrete bench and saw her own name carved into the stone in microscopic letters. Sarah. 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 She didn't cry. She sat and she thought. She pulled out the architectural firm's contracts she had kept in her bag, the last pieces of the paper trail. She began to deconstruct them, her eyes scanning the fine print she had seen 1,000 times. And then, she saw it. A flaw in the foundation. A specific clause in the merger agreement, hidden under layers of technical jargon. It proved that Mark Stevens hadn't just been an accomplice. He had been blackmailing David for years, siphoning the consulting fees into his own private accounts. David hadn't been a willing partner. He had been a victim of his own greed, trapped by a man even more ruthless than himself. Sarah called Jennifer Vance. "I have the leverage," she whispered into the recorded phone. "Give me immunity, and I'll give you the head of the firm." The resolution came not with a bang, but with the scratching of a pen. Sarah stood in the hospital room one last time. Elena Rodriguez was there, holding a single sheet of paper. The DNR order. "He's not there anymore," Sarah said softly. Elena nodded, her hand trembling as she signed the document. The machines began to quiet, the rhythmic hushing of the ventilators slowing to a stop. Sarah looked at David, the man she had loved, the man who had lied to her with every breath. She didn't feel grief. She felt a strange, hollow lightness. She watched from the sidewalk as movers emptied her house. The binders, the receipts, the chronological logs. They were tossed into the back of a van like trash. She didn't try to stop them. She didn't need the paper to prove she was real anymore. A week later, Sarah arrived in Seattle. The city was a grinding machine of lights and sirens, but it was a fresh start. She walked into a small apartment building and signed a new lease. "Name?" the manager asked. "Sarah Miller," she said, then paused. She thought of the stone in her pocket. She took it out and placed it on the counter, leaving it there. "No, Sarah Jenkins, my maiden name." She walked into her new home and set up her professional drafting table by the window. Looking out at the skyline, she felt a quiet, honest liberation. She was no longer a ghost in a dead man's facade. She was the one holding the pen, building a new foundation on the truth.